Patty Chappine, Professor Patty Chappine. She is the adjunct professor of the Arts and Humanities and General Studies at Stockton, and was recently recognized. You can see her now, you can recognize her right now. But she was recently recognized with the 2025 New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance Author Award for her book, New Jersey Women During World War II, on the home front and abroad. How interesting, this is the part of the topic tonight.
Yeah.
And Patty, in the book, as was written in a website I borrowed from, amplifies the often underrepresented voices of women during World War II and how their stories of compassion, bravery, and tireless ambition helped shape the war effort and life on the home front across the Garden State of New Jersey. She received her bachelor's degree in sociology some years ago and her master's in Holocaust and Genocide studies more recently, both from Stockton, and also has her master's and doctoral degrees in history and culture from Drew University. She teaches genocide and Holocaust studies, historical studies, and general studies at Stockton, and she also has spoken about, she's held a class on women in baseball, of particular interest of mine and some others here I know. She also works part-time as the Rudnick Fellow for the Alliance Heritage Center at Stockton, a lifelong Hamilton resident. I'm delighted to introduce a friend of mine, Dr. Patty Chappine.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk to you for maybe about 40 minutes, and hopefully you have some questions. Am I projecting enough? Is that okay? I don't want to yell at you. Sometimes my students feel like I'm yelling and I get excited, but as long as you can hear me, we're all right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, so I have two books, and they're over there. One is the most recent one, which I only have one copy of because it's a hardcover and it's very expensive, and I don't think anyone should pay that much for it. But it is going to be a soft cover by this summer, so it's going to be affordable, and I hope that you can maybe get it at that point. But right now, I can barely afford it, so I just, that's the recent one, and I just want to have it here so you know that this is mostly what I'm talking about. But then I do have the one from 2016 that's smaller, and it's a history press, so it's a little more affordable. So if you want that, it's there, and I'll sign it. So when I first started this research, I wasn't really interested as a young person. So I'll tell you a little bit of a personal story first. So as a young person, I really wasn't very interested in what my grandparents did in the war. They were both World War II generation. My grandfather was apparently in a railroad battalion. He was in the Army. He was drafted, so he didn't really willingly go. But I didn't really have a concept until I got much older, and unfortunately I couldn't ask them what they did, which was always kind of a personal regret of me. So now I feel like I'm always telling my students, and I'm always asking everyone what they did in every case. So I think that kind of spurred in me that desire to want to know. But I can remember that I did have a big interest in, I guess, the trinkets that my grandfather had. So I remember, we always lived with my grandparents. So like we had a duplex, and we were always, a step away from grandmom and her cooking for my whole life, right? Probably to my mother's dismay, because it was always, no one could ever cook as good as grandmom did. So they were always there. And I can remember my grandfather he had this shoebox in his top drawer, and it was all this memorabilia from all over Europe, from European money. It was his patches and his medals. I remember the Good Conduct Medal, and all these things. And whenever he left, he always told me as a kid, just don't touch that stuff. It's old, it's fragile. And of course, the first thing I did when he left was, I got in that top drawer and I just spread it all out on the bed, and it was like a treasure to me. And I didn't really have an idea about really what it meant until I was much older. And then I ended up getting very interested in history, and then in New Jersey history. So I thought to myself, I really didn't get Grandpa's story, and Grandmom really didn't talk about it, and she had to have done something. So I really just kind of started scouring the different archives, and as I was trying to figure out, what was I gonna study in graduate school, I realized there really was this big story of New Jersey women and what they did during the war effort, and especially in South Jersey, where I feel like we really get ignored, right? So, I found these stories, and I'm gonna kind of just go over a little bit about the different interesting things that I found, and hopefully you read. I mean, I can't do it justice in 45 minutes, but, I found stories about what it was like on the home front, what effect rationing had on families, and, the conservation, and, not being able to get new items for your wedding, and just trying to make things from drapes, and painting on hosiery because the nylon was short, right? I love those old photos. I found so many old photos of women going to department stores and trying to paint that line, like trying to really get that seam correct. So it looked like you were wearing the nylon stockings that you could no longer get because the war effort really needed them. I found stories of, women that joined the Army Corps for the first time, women that joined the Navy Waves, the Coast Guard had the spars, women that were pilots, Red Cross women and USO women, and there were just so many women that participated in the war effort throughout the Garden State. And so I hope that this does it a little bit of justice, but also makes you want to learn a little more. And maybe you have relatives that are part of this story as well. And I'd also love to hear about that, because this is always an expanding work. So love to hear your stories too. I think one of the things that stood out for me, and when I teach about this, so I have a class at Stockton that I made up because, believe it or not, we had no class about women in World War II at Stockton. So I thought we definitely need that, right? And the undergraduates love this class. And a lot of them are very surprised, because many of them are from South Jersey. They're very surprised that we had a dim out. Now, they heard of the blackouts and they heard about the air raids and things like that, but not many of them know that because we were really the eastern seaboard, there was this real fear that we would be attacked. There were German U-boats in the Atlantic. They were sinking ships. So there was a fear that if you could see, like let's say Atlantic City, because that's one of those big areas that was in dim out restrictions during that time, that you would be able to see because the ships would be silhouetted because of the lights. So there was that fear that the German U-boats would be able to target ships if it was too bright at the shore. So from 1942 on, you've got dim out restrictions. So, people were turning the blackout shades on, in their hotel rooms. They were painting the headlights low. And a lot of people talk about this. So in this research, I like to bring in the oral histories and the diaries and the written testimonies, and just, what were these women thinking about what was going on? What were they feeling during that time? And a couple of these things really stood out. So this one woman, Pat Witt, who gave me an interview and actually invited me over, and we spent a couple hours together. She was great. So she told me it was very frightening during World War II because we were in blackout time. The headlights of the cars were painted black halfway down. The street lights were capped in low, and we had blackout curtains up at the window. So she even had her blackout curtains. Pat Witt actually gave her blackout curtains to the Millville Army Airfield just a couple years ago. I think she didn't even realize they were in her attic still. So that really kind of stood out to me. And the idea that, a lot of young people had things like the prom that were affected by these wartime changes. And this quote really kind of brings that to light. So this woman talks about the terrible war, it seemed to go on and on. Now I was a high school senior, and our prom was to be held in the gym with the blackout shades down so the light couldn't warn the enemy. So just kind of imagining having a prom, but with these blackout shades drawn, that fear that, you don't want to let light out because it might be the signal to the enemy if they're lurking somewhere. So really just how everything changed on the home front, especially, like I said, in southern New Jersey and the shore points as well. So a couple more interesting quotes. The civil defense, that really came out a lot because people, men and women in these communities and all these local areas just volunteered to be air raid wardens. And they were the ones that maybe people weren't listening to all the time. They weren't the most popular because if there was a drill or you were in dim out restrictions, they would be the ones going up and down the street and seeing if you were in violation. And then they would knock on your door and they would threaten to fine you maybe. So women did that, men and women alike did that. But you also had people that were airplane spotters, so they were actually trained to recognize if there were enemy planes anywhere near, and if they did see an enemy plane, because there was that fear that we would actually be attacked somewhere on the East Coast. If they saw an enemy plane, then they had a number to call, and they could warn the call center, and then the airfield would know about it. So citizens really got involved in their local communities, and they really were a defense. So a couple different quotes that stood out about that. I remember everything went out in air raid, all the streetlights went out, everything was pitch black. And there were actually a lot of accidents that happened during air raids because of that, if people were driving around. The dim outs as well, there are a lot of local newspaper articles that talk about accidents when the dim out restrictions first start. I won't say it's New Jersey, I think it was just, just happens, but so everything was pitch black, and you should have already had the dark shades on your windows, but you better put out all your lights. And then another person just talks about the spirit of community. She said, it just seemed like everybody was doing something, right? If you weren't Rosie the Riveter, you were volunteering, right? You were rolling bandages for the Red Cross, you were setting up USO dances. It just seemed like everyone in the community was coming together in some way. And that's an example. So that's a picture of if you were an air raid warden, let's say, and you were walking around and telling people that they weren't adhering to the restrictions, you would wear something like that. You would have an armband that said what kind of civil defense employee you were, or volunteer really, and you would have a hard hat. And so this woman who actually, witnessed that, she said there were blackouts, you had to cover your windows, and I was an air raid warden, so I'd get out there with my little armband and my flashlight, and I'd look to see if light was peeking out from the neighbors' windows. And this was a strictly volunteer position. And so if you can see that in the corner, that's an example of what the airplane spotters would actually study, so they could see, the differences in the different planes and be able to warn people, right? And a lot of local women did this. So Pat Witt said she remembers her mother was an airplane spotter, and the women were trained to identify any plane that would go over. They would have maybe 4-hour shifts. She said her mother was a school teacher in the daytime, and then she volunteered to do this after her regular job was over. She said if there was an enemy or any kind of suspicion, the phone lines went right to the airfield. We were a defense. She could identify by sound what kind of plane it was. And another woman said, my mother, I remember, used to climb a tower out off the highway, where English Creek is. She used to climb the stairs and be a lookout for airplanes. So there were also these lookout towers that sprang up in different places. And there's one still in Cape May that's actually a historical attraction.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
And Pat Witt, the artist from Millville?
Yes, the Red Barn and the artist. Yep.
Yes.
Yep. And she was a USO girl during that time.
I never knew that.
Yeah, and she was actually 17, and she wasn't supposed to be until she was 18.
Oh,
and
wow.
they saw her playing basketball, she said, at the local YMCA. And, they said, oh, it's okay, you're 17, you can come on. Yeah, she's got some great stories.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. So the first women's branch that existed during this time, and this wasn't the first time, World War II wasn't the first time that the women were involved, because there were Hello Girls in World War I, you may have heard of them, and they worked for the Army Signal Corps, right? During World War II, it was the first time that a women's branch of the Army was created, and it was officially part of the Army very shortly after it was created. So these women, and originally they were only supposed to free men for combat, so they were only supposed to be on the home front at first, and they were only supposed to do things like clerical, administrative duties, but by the end of the war, they were in hundreds of different occupations, and they were sent overseas. So as the war progressed, they did many different things, from control tower operator, some of them were code breakers for the Army and the Navy, some of these women were actually mechanics. Like, they worked on aircrafts, they worked on the different trucks that the military used, they were truck drivers. So like I said, hundreds and hundreds of different things that these women ended up doing at that point. And really quickly, they dropped the auxiliary status. So when they were first recruited, and this was first approved by Congress. They were just an auxiliary, meaning they didn't have military status or benefits, but very quickly, and this woman's painting out the extra A in celebration that they were no longer an auxiliary, the Army realized that they needed them, and they granted them benefits, and then opened up even more specialties that they could do. So, I mean, it really, that was the first step, and then all the other branches quickly realized that they also needed women. So the Navy was next, then the Coast Guard joined in, the Women's Marines, and then the WASPs, and we'll talk about them. They were the pilots. Going quickly, because there's so much to tell you, but I feel like I'm gonna run out of time. Of course, recruiting women, a lot of women talk about those signs, you know, and this one from Hillsdale, New Jersey, she said it just seemed like, you know, I saw we want you, it seemed like all these signs were kind of pointing at me, and, you know, she just decided the Army seems like what I want to do. A lot of women wanted to kind of see the world, and that was one of the things that a lot of the propaganda said, you know, if you join the Army, if you join the Navy, you'll get an education and you'll be able to see the world. And I laughed because one woman that was a New Jersey wave, she joined the Navy, she told me this story, and she said, you know, I was from New Jersey, I saw all these signs and they said, join the Navy, you're gonna see the world. And she said, and I spent the entire time after I trained in Trenton. So it didn't always work. I mean, depending on where you ranked in your class, right? You went through a boot camp and you did testing, and sometimes you got your pick of locations, sometimes you didn't. Sometimes you got to pick what occupation you thought you would be best at, but sometimes they said, you know what, you were doing secretarial work in your civilian life, and we really need that, so too bad you can't be a mechanic like you wanted to be. So it really depended. Everyone had such a different story. I always put this picture up because it gives me anxiety, because this is a parachute rigger. So women in the that worked with the Army Air Forces. At that time, it wasn't called the Air Force yet, right? It was, women that were working with the Army Air Forces. But you could actually be responsible for mending, packing parachutes. And it was a really strenuous job. And a lot of the women that did this talk about, they didn't go out at night. They just wanted to make sure they were rested. And it was very, very important, because if one of those paratroopers had to use their parachute, it had to be packed correctly. And some of them did say that the men would find out, because they would initial, they would know who packed those parachutes. And if they had to use them, and they would come back and give them gifts and say, here's some champagne, thank you. I jumped, I had to use this parachute to evacuate, and it saved me, thank you so much, So, that's just one of those specialized jobs that women did. Along with, they were medical aides. A lot of them worked in Atlantic City at the General Hospital. And they helped to make sure that the patients were taken care of. A lot of them were, like I said, mechanics. They learned the ins and outs of all of these different machines. They were truck drivers. They did things like weather observing and control tower operators. So they did really specialized things that for a long time women were told that they weren't going to be able to do, right? So it was really revolutionary that they were able to do these things that we're talking about. This is just a small sample of what they were actually able to do. The Navy Waves, like I said, so in New Jersey, Waves worked a lot of different places that you may have heard of, from Lakehurst to Wildwood and Cape May and Atlantic City, Camp Boardwalk. So they did a lot of different things too. Some of the jobs did overlap with the Army, but then the Waves also did very specialized things. A lot more Navy Waves were actually cryptographers, which were the code breakers. So if you want to read a great book, Code Girls, wonderful book about the women that were code breaking. Basically, they were trying to figure out, what were the Germans saying? What were the Japanese saying? They were trying to figure out how to get ahead of the enemy, right? And a lot of them worked in Washington, D.C. Some of them worked for the censorship office, right? If you know anything about censorship, sometimes they would cut the letters to the extent that they called them lace curtains, because there was almost nothing left of what the original message was, because they were busy making sure that anything that said where the troop was cut out, anything that the enemy could use, anything that was negative and might affect troop morale was just cut out. So at a certain point, some of them, they were just like little lace curtains. It was like there was nothing of substance left in them. Waves actually became weather analysts too, and this was really the first time that women were what we consider today meteorologists, right? They were actually, going up, they were taking readings, they were trying to predict the weather for the military, and they were writing reports and sending them in. And this one woman, it makes me laugh the way she says it. She said, we had our classes, but then we did our observations up on the roof, where you let the balloons go and you track them by whatever you call those instruments. She couldn't remember at that point. And she said to see how fast they went up and how far they moved at different levels. And that was, she was actually working at Lakehurst. And this is an example of what the cryptologist would do. So this is actually the machine that they would use. It took up basically an entire room. So you could think of, what this looks like, this computer. But back then, that was the very earliest computer. And then, they actually would have to, as you see this woman, she would actually have to go make physical adjustments when the readings weren't correct. So it was a very technical task, but again, these women were kind of on the forefront of early computing. How much time do I have? A little bit of time. They also had women that were pilots. They were actually the only branch that was not considered part of the military at the time. So they weren't actually granted military status until 1977. So very, very late. But at this time, they were considered civilians working with the Army Air Forces, right? So that really had a couple different detrimental effects. Number one, so they couldn't actually get any military benefits. They couldn't get the GI Bill like the other women could. If something happened to them, about 38 of them died during either training or their duty, and the military actually wouldn't pay to send them back either. So their friends would actually have to get a collection together in order to send their bodies back. So it really was it wasn't a good thing, let's say, that these poor women did not get that status until much, much later. So retroactively, they took a look at it and said, okay, this really isn't fair. They did their part, right? They shouldn't be forgotten, and they were granted that status afterwards. But there's one woman who really was instrumental in, number one, getting that recognition, but also making sure that they got the Congressional Gold Medal at a certain point. So in 2008, they were able to get that, and that was B. Haydu, who lived in Monmouth, New Jersey. So really kind of a local legend. She passed away a couple of years ago, but she talks about, these women really were instrumental because while they weren't allowed in combat, they were the ones actually taking the manufactured planes to then go to be used in the theaters of war. So they were, flying tens of thousands of miles across the country delivering these planes, right? They're helping the men pilots actually practice. At certain points, they're actually using ammunition and they're towing targets for the men to practice shooting at them. They did search and rescue missions. I mean, they were really just instrumental in the war effort. And like I said, they really didn't get any recognition at that time till decades later. And it was selective because these women already had pilot's licenses. So they had pilot's license, about 25,000 applied for training, and only a little over 1,000 went through the entire process. So they went to Texas, they trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, and the training was so intensive that they only ever graduated a little over 1,000, right? So during the whole war effort, right? So very, very selective. And so they performed 80% of these ferrying missions, which was taking the planes from the point of manufacture to where they were going to be sent to the war effort. And B. Haydu talks about the other things that they did. She said, we did all the jobs, not just ferrying the aircrafts, towing targets for the anti-aircraft practice shooting, flying at night so the beacons would have an opportunity to practice, or flying gunners as they would have practice shooting from a moving target. The women also trained the men. They also, if the military decided that they wanted to shorten training for the male pilots, they tested it out on the WASPs first, and they always ended up shortening the training. So they knew how to fly everything, even though they weren't allowed in combat. They did know how to fly all the same aircraft as the men did at that point. And like I said, 38 died either in training or during their duty, and they really did have a problem finding jobs in aviation afterwards because all these doors started closing, right? So they would go and they had all this wonderful experience flying, all these thousands of hours flying these military aircraft. And after the war, they would go and try to get a job, and they would say, well, you know, you can be a secretary in the office, you know, and then a lot of them were very disappointed. And B. Haydu talks about this. So she writes a letter to her brother, and she says, I want to find one little spot in this whole world just for me. It can't be any old thing, and since I'm not in love and can't fall back, she says, on the duties of a woman, still, she said, it scares me that I'm just restless, and I don't really have this homesickness that I feel like belongs to all, you know, good girls. So lucky that the positive ending to B's story is that she ends up marrying another pilot, and they start a flight school up in Monmouth. So she is actually able to fly very, very late into her life. So that was, you know, a very rare story, but it worked out for her. And this is a picture of B, and she's actually behind, if you can see. So that's B. Haydu, as, you know, they're signing the Congressional Medal for the WASP as a group. So it's a really huge accomplishment. So who saw the 6888 on Netflix? Anyone? A couple of you? Okay. So you might be surprised to know that there are a couple New Jersey women that were actually in this group. So this was a postal battalion. It was a majority African-American WAC detachment, and they were sent to England to straighten out the mail situation, which had gotten so wildly out of control, they just started piling it into these random warehouses. And they just left it there. And now nobody's getting mail. The poor troops aren't getting any news from home. The people at home aren't getting any news from their loved ones, right? So they basically think these women are gonna fail. So they give them this task and they say, you have 6 months to straighten this out, right? They have to get there and clean the warehouses first because they're a mess. There are rats, there are leaks. They just painted the windows and the blackout so that nobody knew that it was there. But they do it in 3 months, and it's very successful. And you have to think these women, they don't have computers, they have no way. They're just detectives at this point, trying to figure out, you know, where this mail goes, where these guys could possibly be, and how they clear it out. And they work constantly. And these are a couple women from New Jersey that gave oral histories about that. One woman from Clementon, she said the mail seemed like it was just stacked a mile high. And this is just a really cute story. So this woman from Camden, she said, I think one of the nicest things the girls decided on, the packages that were broken where they couldn't find a name or anything, they would save the names and they had a list. And if somebody came in with no names, they just take somebody else's name off the list and they send it to that person. So it may not be what grandma sent, but somebody got something that they wouldn't normally. So she said the girls got a big kick out of that. So I thought that was a really nice thing to do. All right, moving through. The nurses. So this is a picture from Fort Dix. These are nurses walking through a cloud of tear gas. And it's crazy to me that they look so unbothered. I mean, especially the first one is just kind of, you know, just looking around like, where am I supposed to go? But so this actually happened sometimes in Atlantic City, New Jersey, which was where Camp Boardwalk was. A lot of nurses talk about their training and, you know, they did things like this. So it wasn't just, you know, you got your nursing degree and they sent you overseas. They actually did training where they were, you know, geared up, they were doing 10 to 20 mile hikes, and then they would just throw tear gas and say, well, run away from the gas, try to get out of it, right? And a lot of the nurses in Atlantic City talk about, well, we didn't know that this was gonna happen, so we've got all our gear on, we're walking, we're doing this 20-mile hike. We've got blisters, and all of a sudden you hear someone yell gas. And she said, you're trying to get your gas masks on, and you're just inhaling all this sand from the beach because you're in Atlantic City. And it's not, not really the best experience. But a lot of the nurses that were going to end up in evacuation hospitals, which were the ones that were a couple miles behind the front, so they were responding to battlefield casualties. They needed to know these things. They needed to know how to dig foxholes. They needed to know how to, put up their own tents. So they were not, all the nurses weren't on the home front in these hospitals. Some of them were actually overseas in danger. Some of them, were right next to the artillery fire. And this woman talks about it. So she said, and she was from Collingswood, New Jersey. She ended up being in the 131st Evacuation Hospital, and they arrived in London. She said, I just spent one night in London, and that was enough, I'll tell you, to hear those things. And she's talking about the buzz bombs. To hear those things coming, you never know where they're gonna land. A couple did land near where we were and shook the entire building. So these nurses were under this constant threat, and she actually, her and her unit, actually started moving closer to where the Nazis were. So they leave England, and she's kind of going towards where the Germans are, and they end up stumbling across a concentration camp in Austria, and then they help the liberation forces actually deal with the survivors and try to help them as best that they can. But the story that she tells, and that a lot of other women from that 131st tell, to me is really amazing, because they're all like 20 years old. I mean, they're young, and I think like my students are the same age, and these people are telling these stories. But so there's about 40 nurses in this evacuation hospital, and they arrive at Mauthausen, and the men go in first, and it's horrible, obviously. People are starving, there's a lot of dead bodies, and the colonel says to the nurses, just stay here, and the boys are gonna go in, and we're gonna see what's going on. And he comes back out and he addresses these 40 young women, and he says, it's really bad in there, and if you don't want to go in, then you're not going to get in trouble. And not a single one of those nurses refused to go in. They all said, of course, we're going to go in. And they went in and they helped, and it was very difficult. But I mean, just that they said that, no hesitation, not one of them said that they wouldn't go in. I've got a couple minutes, so I'm just gonna close with Camp Boardwalk. So you may know that Atlantic City transformed during the war. It became a basic training area for the troops. It became a rehabilitation center. So 5 of these major hotels actually transformed into the Thomas England General Hospital, which was the largest general military hospital in the nation at the time, and a lot of troops were rehabilitated there. So this picture is actually troops that were using their prosthetic legs. They're learning how to walk and do exercises out on the sun deck of the Thomas England. So really a lot of physical therapy, early physical therapy was going on. There were innovations in healthcare that were going on, and the military nurses were really helping these troops who had come over from the front injured in various ways. All right, we're not gonna have time to talk about the Rosies, unfortunately. I knew I was gonna do this. So real quick, and then I hope you have some questions. At war's end, it was very difficult. Like, these doors were closing, like I said. We didn't get a chance to talk about Rosie the Riveter, but there was a lot of industry in New Jersey. And even in South Jersey, a lot of women ended up at the New York Shipbuilding Company, in Philadelphia, and various places. So people were really working. There were a lot of different things that were going on. And this woman says, at the end of the war, we retreated. Now just go back and you be housewives, and that's it. You're all finished now. That was the attitude. Most of us wanted our degrees. We were cut off in the middle of our college careers, so we all went back to our respective universities. We were all definitely career women from this experience and had no intention of going home and forgetting. There's this great section of one of the books I assigned to my students is called Our Mother's War, and it's by Emily Yellen. and she talks about many different things, and it's not New Jersey women, it's kind of women as a whole in the nation. But there's this great story about this woman who writes to her husband, or her husband to be, I think, and he's off in the Army, and she said, you know, I've been working while you were gone, and I take great enjoyment from it now. And she's like, so basically when you come home, I just want you to know that I'm not gonna stop working, and I hope you can live with me. And she said, I'm not gonna be making dinner every night, and you know, there are laundries for the clothes, and you know, all this stuff is gonna change. And we never really get the reply, which I'm really, to my great disappointment.
You didn't get the mail.
Yeah, yeah, it might have been before the 688 showed up,
Right.
so we don't know. But the idea of, even though these doors are closing and some did go back to, you know, that sense of normalcy before the war, some women just kind of got that sense of they knew that they could accomplish certain things, and they knew that certain jobs were not beyond them as they had been told. So it really did impact them a great deal. And like I said, New Jersey women were doing so much, and I could talk so much more about that, but I hope you have questions. So
Yes.
we're almost at time. So,
Very interesting.
and I'd love to hear from you. So easy, my email is just patriciachappine@gmail.com. So if you have any stories or anything, or just want to chat, feel free. I always love hearing from people and talking about history. So, but do you have any questions about
I have a
anything?
question.
Robert.
Thank you.
Yes, very good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I wanted to know how you went about researching these women to interview them.
Yeah, I interviewed some I just found. So Pat Witt, I was just at the Millville Army Airfield Museum because
Oh,
I thought,
yeah.
you know, I should go here and see what they have. And the director said, oh, do you know Pat Witt? And I felt the way she said it, I should obviously know her,
Right,
and I didn't, right? But yeah, a lot of times it was just things like that where I was places I was researching, and then someone mentioned someone that was still around, and you know, you should talk to them, right? And in other cases, I just found oral histories that other people had taken. So the Library of Congress has a huge repository that you can go look. Some of them are transcribed, some of them are just audio, but you can listen. It's all free to listen. So you can go on the Library of Congress, the Veterans History Project online, and search for whatever you want, men and women. Rutgers has some good stuff. There's
Who? I didn't hear that, I'm sorry.
Rutgers University
Rutgers,
has
sure.
some oral history, and
Right.
you can, you know, look at the transcriptions. So I would say there's a lot of digital things, thankfully, that you can kind of get those oral histories and then, you know, use them or just listen if you're interested. Yeah. Yeah.
You didn't try to, I'm sorry, advertise to find folks like that?
To
You know,
advertise?
yeah, did you ever do any kind of advertising for
Just
it?
word of mouth, and I would just kind of ask
Mainly.
people
Okay,
that I knew.
thank you.
Yeah. I think that's good. But, you know, social media is good if you just want to say, one of the few things, I don't often praise Facebook, but, you know, you could probably
Yeah,
be in
me
touch
too.
with people like that, yeah.
I went down with a friend from another club down to the Millville Museum, and there had to be like 12 different people there, you know, docents that knew like anything and everything that you were, and that place was really incredible. It was a lot bigger than I thought it was.
Yeah, it is, and the displays are amazing.
Yes.
You don't think, because it seems so small from outside,
Yeah.
but just amazing.
Yeah, it
And
goes
they
way
lent
back.
us
Yeah.
for the camp. I did a Camp Boardwalk exhibit that was at the Noise Arts Garage in Atlantic City that was running the last couple months, and they lent us a lot. Millville was great, and they were like, it's free, you can take it, you know. And I was just going through, it was so great because I was just picking things. I was in these displays, and I'm like, oh look, it's an air raid helmet, and I was just like, can we have that? Can we have that? And she was like, yeah, sure, you can have it.
Wow.
So yeah, really great.
The other thing is for the plane spotters.
Yeah.
The school on Middle Road was a plane spotter location. And we interviewed a lady who used to do that back during the war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Middle Road, where
Yeah.
is that?
Right-
Here?
right
In
close
Hamilton?
by, yeah.
Okay, I'm still learning.
Yeah, go ahead.
To the plane spotters,
Yeah.
did they ever spot one?
not enemies. So we didn't have enemies, thankfully, on the East Coast.
Well, I never heard of it.
Yeah.
I never heard of
Yeah,
it.
but there was
you
that
know,
fear, right? And
Yeah.
you never knew, because this is the thing, that the First World War, they didn't have these issues, but because the plane technology had advanced so much, and they had aircraft carriers, there was finally the possibility that the range had increased, and they might. So yeah, there was that fear, and luckily it never
Yeah, because there was talking.
materialized. There were false alarms, certainly, but yeah,
Because they were talking about the submarines off
yes.
Cape May coast.
Yeah,
you know,
and they, people along the shore do talk about, they saw the debris wash up from those battles, and the oil and stuff. So that was something that people saw. It was a very visceral and real fear. Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
I was there on Middle Road at that, but I was born in '37, and my grandmother and grandfather were both spotters. And
Oh, wow.
the story goes that I guess I was 5. A milk truck stopped across the street, and I ran right across the street, barely missing, but being killed by a truck. So I got home, and my mother said, you could have been killed, you would have died. I said, that's all right. He said, I'm going to see you on Judgment Day.
Oh,
Jeez.
Lord.
And then the other story I have is that my wife's mother, Beatrice Craig, worked at the bomb factory in Millville. In Mays Landing.
Yeah.
The story was that it's a legend that they made the bomb, the big bomb, that ended the war.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, and there were actually some explosions reported at these, because there were, there was the Hercules Power Company, and there were a lot of munitions being manufactured in New Jersey, right? And there was also a fear of sabotage at these particular places, because there was this idea that, someone could infiltrate. So they were encouraged, don't talk about anything you're doing at work. Don't talk about your hours. Don't say anything, right? So there were so many different layers of what it was like on the home front. Yeah, really interesting.
I have one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll keep on. So I had a cousin, Virginia Parker, who was a journalist, and she joined and ended up in South Pacific. We knew that she became friendly with the family there. But when she died, I inherited a lot of her papers, and she actually, over the years, became a benefactor, sent money to raise their children.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
That's
wow.
really interesting.
Nice.
Thank you.
So, I just read a historical fiction book about nurses in World War II called Fire by Night, and it made me want to do some research. One of the things that was amazing to me about nurses in World War II was when Corregidor fell in 1942, there were about 100 nurses that were imprisoned in Manila for the duration of the war, like 3 years later, and managed to survive.
Yep.
So your comment about how women ultimately were exposed, they may have been in evacuation hospitals, but they were often behind the lines. And I don't know if any of those women were Jersey connected.
Yeah, there were actually a few. I talked to one, and I forgot about her. She lived in Morristown. She passed away a few years ago, but she was actually one of the people in the Philippines. Yeah, and so they were almost killed. They were actually, moments away probably when they were finally rescued, but then they had problems, like health problems, because they were so malnourished, and they were trying to treat the other POWs in the camp, amazingly.
That's what their role was in
Right,
the POW camp.
right, yeah.
And of course, they also suffered, besides the physical, many of them had PTSD.
Yeah,
too.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, and there's, I think Angels of Baton is a great book about that, about the nurses, yeah.
And just, I was amazed with the dim out. I never knew about that, but I do know that my mom talked about the curtains.
Right,
And that's all I ever knew. The other thing is, she told me how, there was like a little black market, I guess, in New York,
yeah,
that, for the stockings,
yep,
so, because nobody could get the stockings.
Yeah.
And, she did tell me about the rationing. I actually had the coupons. She had left them, and, unfortunately, they got destroyed in the flood I had, but I was treasuring those, because I
Yeah.
guess they were like, I don't know, food stamps
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
right, or
Exactly.
whatever,
yeah, so you
so.
needed the
To
stamp
see that
and the
from
money,
that era
right.
was, amazing
Yeah,
for me,
definitely,
yeah.
definitely. And
And just one more thing, my stepfather, Frank Winfield, he was in the Philippines. And one thing that he told, I know it's about a man, but he said, my mom used to cook rice and he would not eat it. Because it was nothing but fish heads and rice is all they
Right.
ate there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, the rationing, a lot of
you
talk
couldn't
about.
cook fish with him either.
And a lot of the women talk about the gas rations too, because there was tire supply issues. So
Mhm.
there was a speed limit, a national speed limit. The
Oh, I
victory
didn't know
speed
that.
was 35 miles an hour.
Can you imagine?
And everyone was rationed on gasoline,
Gasoline,
although farmers
yes.
could get more. So Pat Witt actually talks about that she got a little extra because her family owned a farm.
Hmm.
And if you were in certain jobs, you could get a little more. But there's this woman that I quote in one of the exhibit, the panels in the Camp Boardwalk, and she said that she actually, throughout her life, was afraid of letting her gas tank run below a certain amount because of the rationing.
I'm
Because
like
she was
that
always
now.
scared that suddenly it would come back, right? So that trauma was always there. You know, what do I do? I can't let my gas tank get below a certain
Right,
amount. Yeah. Anyone else any questions?
Really interesting, yeah.
You know, I was fortunate, I was in junior high, my social studies teacher was a WASP.
Oh wow.
And she lost a semester just talking about her experiences.
That had to be
Wow.
great to hear.
And-
though. Wow.
The thing that got me is she flew 18 different types of airplanes.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know, the guys didn't do that.
18.
And then the other thing that they don't say is that they ferried the planes from the United States to England. They were the ferry people. They used to fly them from the manufacturer. They used to go from Maine over to Labrador, Labrador over to Iceland, and Iceland back into England.
And you had, and before the WASPs, you had women that wanted to fly here that actually joined the British women because
Yeah,
we didn't
and
have it yet.
that group flew
Yeah.
all over. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
so-
But yeah, she never made it to the gold medal. But
Oh, yeah.
she was very interesting talking about what they had to put up with. I mean, they used to sleep in the planes. You
Yeah.
know, they used to do all that kind of stuff. So it was really tough, but very,
Yeah, I
very
bet.
interesting.
Sometimes the men sabotage their planes too. There were a couple
Well,
instances of that.
Sometimes they
as well.
sabotage the plane to see
Yeah.
the woman too. Kept her there.
But yeah, that's amazing that you had that teacher. Wow. Anyone else? Any questions or comments?
Well, thank you very much.
Yes,
Pat.
Thank you.
you.
You had some great
Very
questions.
good.
Thank you so much. I'll be here and if you wanna get a
Very
book or
interesting.
talk a little more.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah, same here, maybe you'll see you. We have, if you look us up on, if you have the time, we have presentations like April 15th, there's one. Fella, he's from Landisville, Scala, and he's gonna talk on a book that he wrote, it's called Scoundrels and Seafarers, and it's about pirates in New Jersey.
Oh, that would be
And
good.
part of Maryland, so if you wanna come out, look us up. We're in Landisville.
Landisville.
Unit
Okay.
Historical.
All righty, thank you.
Good luck.